The problem with public administration is not that public servants are out of control, it is that they are over-controlled. The main objective of many public servants is not actually achieving concrete results for citizens. It is complying with the generations of detailed rules that have decade by decade overlain and determined the way they operate. One of the fundamental characteristics of American political culture is distrust of government.
Welcome to Management Matters. I'm James-Christian Blockwood. In this week's episode, we'll be sharing highlights from a recent panel at the 2025 Academy National Conference, The State of Public Administration, with Vanessa Williamson of the Brookings Institution, Professor Frank Fukuyama, renowned author and political scientist and an Academy Fellow, and Philip Howard, the founder and chair of Common Good. This panel was a captivating discussion about the state of American public service in the 21st century, how to rebuild and retool government capacity from all angles, and where we go from here. Next week, we'll feature the informative Q&A session from this same panel.
Wanted to just start with maybe first a minute of your reflections, and then we'll get into some specific questions. And so maybe we'll start with you, Vanessa, and then we'll work our way down.
It's nice to get to preach to the choir a little bit. I think we all spend a lot of our time talking about the urgency of a government that has the capacity to fulfill the will of the people. And that sounds like a foreign language all too often in the United States. I think that, a long-standing trend of moving towards an anti-government rhetoric. And of course, there are always things that can be improved, and everyone has their individual DMV experience, as the general mentioned. But at a certain point, what you're doing is undermining the very institutions that enact our democracy, right? That not just pass the laws or, give the speeches, but the people who actually do the work of implementing what the American people have demanded. And so in a sense, there's a point at which anti-tax rhetoric, anti-government rhetoric becomes anti-democratic rhetoric. And I'm afraid that that's the point we're at today.
I appreciate your frank acknowledgement of the crisis that public administration is in under this administration, but this is something that's been building over the years. I think that it's important to correctly understand what the problem in government and in the bureaucracy is. There is a narrative that has been articulated by conservatives, really beginning in the New Deal with the growth of the administrative state, that says that the problem of government is that you have unelected bureaucrats that have escaped the control of their democratically legitimated political leaders and are making policy on their own, contrary to the wishes of the American people. And I think that we have to recognize, first of all, there is a problem in the way that bureaucracy, that public administration actually delivers services, but the interpretation of the underlying problem is about 180 degrees in the wrong direction. The problem with public administration is not that public servants are out of control, it is that they are over-controlled. The main objective of many public servants is not actually achieving concrete results for citizens. It is complying with the generations of detailed rules that have decade by decade overlain and determined the way they operate. One of the fundamental characteristics of American political culture is distrust of government. And in a way, those, especially the ex-ante rules about how you procure office furniture in a federal agency, is the result of not trusting public servants to actually use their own good judgment and common sense in making these kinds of decisions in a way that their private sector counterparts are able to do. And so I think that actually, if you think about the reform task that needs to be accomplished, you really need to, you actually need to deregulate. But the first object of deregulation ought to be not so much the private sector as the public sector, that you need to delegate authority to civil servants to use their best judgment in order to get results, and you ought to reward them not by rule compliance, by complying with these detailed rules that, have accumulated over the generations, but by actually getting concrete results in terms of the services, the procurements, everything else that they're expected to do. So I would begin with just this understanding of what the actual problem is that we are facing.
I think the solution, and we can talk about this, needs to be bold, not simply pushing back on the bad things that are happening, but presenting a bold new vision. And I think it has to confront what I view as a fatal flaw in the operating philosophy of post-60s government, that governing is a matter of legal compliance, not just human judgment. We have to go back to a place where we honor public citizens and public officials for their values and their judgment. And you can have checks and balances, ex post decisions, but if you try to tell people how to make every decision, you're not only going to guarantee failure, but also guarantee public alienation.
A strong administrative state does not mean a deep state. How do you achieve the right balance of empowering and listening to the expertise and advice of a strong, nonpartisan civil service, but also respecting election outcomes and the responsibilities of those that have been elected and hold office? Let's start with Vanessa.
Well, I think first you need to confront, they're the long-term problems that we've talked about, right? The sort of accretion of rules and the sort of damage to the trust and the capacity for the individual judgment of the people who enact our government. But I think we also need to be upfront about the fact that the crisis we're going to face, the rebuilding that we're going to be talking about, involves some new problems in addition to our old problems. First of all, of course, there's just the catastrophic loss of manpower across many of our, in some cases, 100% loss of manpower across our agencies. A loss of manpower that happened in an extremely arbitrary way that was certainly in no way the way you would want to reduce, if you thought reductions were necessary, want to reduce a workforce. And what that means is not just the actual loss of work done this year, but of course the enormous damage it will do to hiring going forward. So as we start to think about what our solutions are, we need to recognize that the trade-off we used to ask people from the private sector, that is to say, probably your salary is going to be a little lower, but hey, there's this stability. We've set fire to that advantage on the public side this year. And I think that the consequences of that are going to be really, really severe. So that's the first of the sort of new problems that I think we'll need to confront as we're thinking about how we're going to move forward. Because I think you're exactly right to imagine that we're going to need very bold solutions for the future. So that's the first one. And the second one is, in a number of agencies, I think the real challenge of politicization, right? A marked effort to move the administration of the state towards supporting one party is, frankly, a problem that we haven't confronted in 120, 130 years as a country, right? These are two challenges that I wanted to make sure we had on the table as we're thinking about what the bold solutions are, right? Because we absolutely need to confront our longstanding problem of the sort of accretion, but we also need to confront these additional new challenges.
So on the question of accountability, obviously the most important source of accountability are elections and the oversight by democratic leaders. The courts are also an important source of accountability, but I think that the way that the interaction of the courts and the bureaucracy has evolved over the years becomes very problematic. In the United States, we have a practice called private right of action. In most European democracies, if an agency makes a rule, that agency, the state itself, is responsible for enforcing it. In the United States, we have this tradition of getting private individuals to enforce rules by litigating. And they do that with great abandon in a way that's not typical of any other democracy. And I think part of the problem with the slowness and the cumbersomeness of bureaucracy is the fact that so much of our bureaucratic decision-making is either fed through this kind of a legal process or anticipates that kind of a legal process. So, for example, why does an environmental impact assessment take thousands of pages and several years to accomplish? It's not because the bureaucrats themselves are slow or dim-witted or can't write. It's because they are trying to anticipate every single public interest litigation group that's going to sue that particular assessment for not having met some kind of a legal standard. And as a result, they anticipate a kind of ex post review in advance. And that pervades a lot of bureaucratic decision making. And so I think that, and by the way, this is not just on a federal level. I come from the state of California, where we have this wonderful law called CEQA that actually gives standing to all 40 million residents of California to sue any project they want with no statute of limitations, and they can sue anonymously, right? So it creates this enormous burden, I think, on the operation of a bureaucracy that then has to anticipate an institution that's basically meant to hold them accountable, but it's actually not achieving that end. And I think that's something that really needs to be seriously rethought.
I subscribe to everything Frank just said. I write books about how our laissez-faire approach to lawsuits has undermined our system of freedom at all levels of society, and including governance. I'd like to address the question in terms of political accountability. In my view, public officials have a dual loyalty. They have a loyalty to obey the law and do their duty as public citizens, and they also are supposed to be accountable to the people who are politically elected to lead our country. And there are areas where that tension is obviously quite real and profound, and I think the line has to be drawn in ways that I haven't actually seen people articulate. I think the Academy could maybe take this on as a project, but in my view, people who are experts have to be free to exercise their expert judgment in their good faith and not change those opinions. I'm prepared to let a politically appointed leader overrule them, but I'm not prepared to have a politically appointed leader fire someone because they don't like the labor numbers that come out. And so I think there was a mechanism in the Lloyd La Follette Act of 1912 that said that civil servants would be accountable could be fired without notice and without hearings and trials and such by the president, but what was in the Civil Service Commission maintained the authority to overrule a decision if they found, not with the trials, it's their own investigation, they thought that the decision was politically motivated. And I think having a speed bump like that is important, because why would good people come to government if coming to government requires you to be a toady to views that you completely disagree with? I mean, you want to have the dignity of your professional opinions. So I think it's really important to begin to articulate, what we mean by a merit system, and not only what the obligations of public servants are, but also what their standing is to stand up for what's right.
Vanessa, you mentioned earlier that we're in a room and somewhat speaking to the choir here. I mean, I can speak with great certainty and confidence that the people here that are joining us with the conference care very much about our government and public service. You're all authors and you are trying to help disseminate that positive message, but who should be the audience and how do we reach them?
Yeah, I have a new book coming out next week. So if you can tell me if anyone else on the panel knows how to reach the audience right away, just let me know. I'm here for that information. No, I mean, I think that there's a lot of ways in which street level bureaucrats have an extraordinary power to reach Americans and to explain what government does, and they often do. This is, for example, the experience of the public schools is something that gives people that shared understanding that the government provides certain kinds of services, that there are places where we all are invited to participate. I think a lot of the problem is that people are experiencing politics exclusively, increasingly not even through words, but through video, which is its own problem. But, just in this very mediated way, they experience politics in a mediated way that encourages doing something outrageous, being on one team or the other and shouting very loudly, as opposed to the actual experience of politics, directly, where you actually participate in some way, which encourages compromise, encourages seeing everyone who's participating as another person. And, and so I think the government, if that's a story about how people experience politics, I think it also is a story about how people can experience government. The other issue for which I do not have a solution, is I think to some extent, some of the dysfunction in our systems of representation and in our courts that we already discussed have been applied to our civil service, right? So the idea that government can't get anything done, well, that is a relatively accurate story about Congress today, right? Very, very little is getting done over there, but people transmute that story over onto our public servants. And so I think a related challenge to this question of how do you get people to know what government does and to think seriously about what public servants provide is that a lot of the government that they see is either shouting in Congress or occasionally the dysfunction in the courts. And so thinking about how to create more of that frontline direct experience, so with Social Security, for example, is another one where people have a direct experience of government and it changes how they see what government is because it works. Even if, they had to fill out some paperwork. They had to go to an office, all these things. The direct personal experience is one of the only things that I think can override the sort of mediated, highly partisan, highly ideological talk about what government is.
Yeah, I think it's hard to convince people of an alternative narrative about government when the guy at the top of the government is the chief dispenser or the chief denigrator of government. But there's other things that can be done through the education system. I run a public policy program, a small public policy program at Stanford. With every opportunity, if one of my students actually wants to go into finance, I try to tell them not to do that, to actually think about going into public service. But there's a bigger problem, especially in elite universities like Yale, Harvard, Stanford, and so forth. We've actually given up on what used to be called civics education. We used to have a core course at Stanford on Western civilization that actually taught people what the philosophical origins of modern liberal democracy were, how it evolved over time, and then culminating in reading the Federalist Papers and giving students an understanding about how the U.S. constitutional system is supposed to work. This was abolished in the 1980s. Most elite schools really deconstructed, these kinds of programs into really something that doesn't constitute a core education for citizenship. And I think that, in my experience, among my students with the undergraduates, what they know about American government, they learned in their AP history classes in high school, not anything they took away in the university. So one way of, I think, restoring a certain civic sense is to restore, the education of, frankly, American elites as to what their own system is, how it's supposed to work, and how they have a duty to serve that system rather than simply, serving themselves.
I think the audience is something like 2/3 of the American public think government is broken. So I think what would speak to them is a bold vision of making government work again. And I think they would respond to accountability. I think the biggest problem with public service certainly the biggest problem with red tape is the idea of trust. No one trusts anyone, so they write another rule, then they write another rule, they write another. Everything's about distrust. And Frank and I have talked about this. I think moving, for example, from ex-ante controls, procurement procedures designed to be completely neutral that take years and result in lousy products being bought, to ex-post controls where you have a review committee that has the power to approve a big contract, for example, but allows the procurement officials to use their judgment. The innovations like that would result in much better products and be much better jobs for the public official. So I think having a simple, bold new vision with core principles like the merit system is one that I think the public might respond to. And I write about how legal structures affect human behavior. So it covers everything: healthcare, schools, how government works, how people interact in the workplace. There's not one of those areas where the experts don't agree that the system is broken. Everyone thinks that the system needs to get rebooted to make more sense, to cut red tape in healthcare and schools and such, to fix bad schools, et cetera. So I think that a bold new vision by the Academy would resonate, and I think you could find common cause with other reformers in other areas for a big overhaul agenda that I think the country is overdue for.
The Academy will certainly take up that charge on helping outline that vision. But let's start today, since we have all of you as experts. What are smaller pieces of that vision that are very practical, very tangible, and things that we can start and do now. Maybe Frank, if you want to.
An obvious area is government procurement. General McChrystal already started a critique of the way that the Pentagon buys weapons. And this is true of many government agencies, especially buying IT computer systems. Jen Paulka, I don't think, is at this conference, but she's written a brilliant book about this, Recoding America, because she has direct experience with both the IT sector and the reason that the government has such a hard time dealing with it, because procurement occurs according to a very complex rule book, and it's procured in a very inflexible way. If you look at the way that Silicon Valley deals with They do procurement as well, and it is a far more flexible system that involves continual interaction between the procuring agency and and the suppliers with constant feedback loops. Actually, the country that's done an incredible job innovating in this area is Ukraine, right? So the Russia-Ukraine war is entirely a drone war right now. Every Ukrainian brigade has a private company behind it that is making drones. And when they use a drone and something doesn't work in the software, they call up the company, they give them their experience. And oftentimes within a week, they get an updated software that they can install in their equipment to make it work better. And the U.S. government cannot do that. It cannot procure IT in anything less than a 10-year cycle. And so you've got to free up the decision-making to get rid of a lot of those rules to permit this kind of continual interaction. And frankly, that interaction really has to go all the way back to Congress. It can't just go back to the Pentagon, because ultimately it's Congress that is providing the money for the equipment. And so the appropriators have to know when they've misallocated, funds, and it really ought to go to a different kind of system. And that communication ought to be happening on a very, very fast time cycle. So that's, I think, something very concrete that we could address, right away.
I think I'd say, just building on that, one of the areas where I think, unfortunately, this year we took a bunch of steps back, but we also will need, things like the U.S. Digital Service and other initiatives to help our agencies actually build things internally, so that they didn't always have to procure everything on any kind of timescale, but they actually had the skills in-house to build the IT that they needed, and they could do, and they were sort of building up not just the skills on the actual technical side, but also the skills in terms of how do you think about it, like a user experience and who's going to use any of the software we're producing. And I think there had been moves since the Obama administration, at least in that direction, and we lost a lot of that expertise this year. But I think it's one of the very obvious places to for tangible right away rebuild.
If I could just comment on that, I think one of the unfortunate things that began in the 1980s is the whole move towards outsourcing. And we outsourced way too much technical expertise. And so now, if you got an IT problem in an agency, you go to Arthur Andersen or IBM or some other, external contractor. You can't monitor one of those contracts if you yourself don't have the technical knowledge, about the systems that you are trying to modify. And so I think we desperately need to rebuild the internal capacity of government agencies and get the programmers. And then that means a whole different set of personnel rules, because young people that have a choice of going into a firm in Silicon Valley or going into government, it's right now, that's a pretty bad trade-off there. And I think we got to increase the flexibility of people to go in and out of government that have the appropriate skills, not tie them down necessarily in a single job for the rest of their lives. All changes like that, I think, are really critical.
All the experiments in procurement, I worked on procurement in the reinventing government days, back with Al Gore and such. And so they made it possible to go to Staples and buy office supplies. That was an innovation, not much of an innovation. But I just read a draft article about an experiment in the Army where 2 brigades were given procurement authority to do whatever they wanted. They were given a limited sum of money. I think it was $5 million each. And they came up with extraordinary weapons that fit their particular mission. And they were different than the other weapons. It's just amazing what people will do if they have flexibility. So my sermon for overhaul is, because trust is such a problem, start creating oversight bodies. Instead of subjecting some poor person to 6 months of red tape to get hired in an agency, to have a second path or parallel paths where people in the agency have authority to hire somebody subject to review by some independent body that is not nepotistic or something, not the spoil system. But having a subject to oversight body can free up 1,000 pounds of red tape for 1 week of oversight review after the fact. It's just much more efficient. We just need to come up with new models.
Management Matters is a presentation of the National Academy of Public Administration, produced by Lizzie Alwan and Matt Hampton, and edited by Matt Hampton.